The Daily Exchange! Guys, we're back here. We're talking all about the US congressional hearings with Facebook and Libra with Michael Pacina. We'll see you guys in just a sec. All right, guys, welcome back. I'm here with Michael Pacina. He's a partner at Piper Alderman and a lead at the blockchain and fintech group. Welcome back to the Daily Exchange.
Thanks so much for having me again, Fred.
Some stuff. Now, Michael, you lead the blockchain group at Piper Alderman. And also you're on numerous advisory boards. Really, quite the blockchain lawman when it comes to it. Really.
I do a little bit.
I like it. Now, we've got some big news happening right now. Overnight, we've had the U.S. congressional hearings. We've had Senate on the night before, I guess night or day before, depending on which way you look at it. We've got the Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell coming out comparing Bitcoin with speculative gold. We're going to get into all of this. Now, to set the scene, I just want to sort of get a high level. Where do you think we're sort of at with these congressional hearings? What does this mean from a legal perspective?
Fred, I think this is what blockchain adoption looks like. This is where the government pays attention and says this is a real thing. I think up to now, a lot of reserve banks have come out and said the crypto world is too small. Certainly our own reserve bank, in a speech, one of the heads said, when this is bigger, we'll pay closer attention, but it's such a small piece of the economy at the moment that we don't need to worry about it. And Facebook's potential to bring 2 billion users into a blockchain/crypto style ecosystem, depending on whether you think it's a cryptocurrency or a blockchain or not, has caught the attention of the world. Facebook has a huge profile and some very significant trust issues. And I think those combined have led to the response which has happened in Washington.
Okay, so it's a kind of a big deal. That we've got a clip here coming up with our mate Stephen Mnuchin. We talked about it yesterday. Joel, if you want to spin it for everyone.
Recently, as you know, there's been a great deal of interest about digital assets, including cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin and Libra. There are many regulatory and supervisory questions regarding Libra, virtual assets, and virtual currencies, but I will focus primarily on the serious concerns the Treasury has regarding the growing misuse of virtual currencies by money launderers, terrorist financiers, and other bad players. Cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin have been exploited to support billions of dollars of illicit activity like cybercrime, tax evasion, extortion, ransomware, illicit drugs, human trafficking.
Okay, so Mr. Mnuchin here has talked a lot about, cryptocurrencies with illicit drugs, money laundering. What's your view from a legal perspective on that?
Well, Fred, recently at the Australian Davos Connection Forum in Adelaide, I was lucky enough to interview a major Canadian bank's head of financial crime. Now, he said, number one, we don't know the extent to which cryptocurrencies are used in money laundering. But number two, he didn't think that it could be any worse than the amount of money laundering going on in the cash economy. And number three, his view that cryptocurrencies were the worst possible path for someone wishing to launder money or engage in crime because of the immutable nature and auditable nature of the transactions. Pseudo-anonymity doesn't protect criminals. And unfortunately, the view of the media was that only 0.1, we don't know how much money laundering is going on in the crypto world, was all that got published in the Australian media. But the reality of it is this is a terrible technology if you want to commit crimes. A censorship-resistant, easily auditable trail. Pseudo-anonymity doesn't provide people protection once that anonymity is lost, and there are many companies working on connecting wallet addresses with real-world identities.
Right. Now. So obviously, there's a crackdown here, and he's reaffirmed FinCEN and its responsibilities with AML, KYC. Australia does the same thing. So Austract does the same thing here in Australia. Do you think that's going to, how do you think that's going to impact cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, for example?
Well, I think that Australia's really lucky because we moved early with businesses like Independent Reserve and BTC Markets going in to have amendments made to our anti-money laundering laws, creating a digital currency exchange definition and a registration requirement with AUSTRAC. We're now in a position where more than 250 crypto exchanges globally have registered into Australia so that they can serve Australian customers. And in doing so, they have to meet obligations to report suspicious transactions and threshold transactions. That is a framework that's existed under the FATF guidelines. Australia is, like many countries, still catching up with the latest guidelines. While we only catch fiat to crypto at the moment, in the future we'll have crypto to crypto court as well. And that's very important because money laundering is a serious issue and terrorism financing is a serious issue. So that kind of registration and reporting of transactions into AUSTRAC is important. And there are similar agencies in America that deal with that there.
So crypto to crypto is the new part that's being added. Fiat to crypto and crypto to fiat is sort of the one they're really sort of, looking at now, and then obviously, expanding that in the future is what you're saying.
That's right. Currently, crypto to crypto is not a designated service under the AML-CTF Act, so there's no registration requirements if an exchange is not providing fiat currency to cryptocurrency transactions. Okay. But it's really important because that act has provided a definition of digital currency which can be used in other laws. So it's an important first step. So
with this congressional hearing, is this a big deal?
Congressional hearings create a lot of light, but maybe not so much heat. They can be called by Congress and the Senate, as they have been, by the various committees that sit. Australia doesn't have a similar history of bringing businesses in for these kinds of hearings. In America, it's used much more publicly. And this, of course, came out of the announcement of Facebook in the formation of the Libra Association. And interestingly enough, that famous now letter from the Financial Committee signed only by Democrats. So this appears to be a Democrat-led series of hearings. It's been interesting that the Republican side has been a lot more quiet, and in fact the House Minority Leader came out recently effectively endorsing and saying he likes Bitcoin.
Wow, okay, that's a big deal. We've got another clip here from, I'd say, on the other side, Senator Sherrod Brown. Now, he seems to not be the biggest fan of Facebook right now. Facebook just recently had a $5 billion fine for privacy. So you've got this sort of, coming together of two worlds, and let's talk about this in just a second. I just want to roll this clip. It's about trust, really.
Facebook told us they were keeping our data safe when they were really allowing other companies to sift through private messages. You had to shut down those programs after huge backlash. Over and over, Facebook has said, just trust us. And every time Americans trust you, they seem to get burned. After all the times Facebook has abused the public's trust, and you know that, do you really think people should trust Facebook with their hard-earned money?
Okay, so this is obviously some pretty intense stuff, right? So there's Facebook and Libra, and I guess is Bitcoin getting sort of, carried into this as well? And, why is the US government so interested in cryptocurrency right now?
Well, as we discussed before, Fred, I think it's an adoption issue. Now there's a real possibility that a huge number of people are going to come into using these cryptocurrencies that previously were viewed by governments as niche or fringe. So this was always going to happen. If the dreams of early Bitcoin users were coming true, with large numbers of people coming into the network and using it, more and more users, this exact same response would be expected from regulators to say, number one, we don't really understand it, and we need to understand it. And number two, are the existing rules around financial services going to operate effectively with this new technology? There's always a lag between the law and technology. Facebook has this fundamental problem that they have a trust issue. And that big fine doesn't seem to be that big compared to their overall revenues, but at least it's putting some of these things behind them in terms of these previous trust problems. I think there was one view expressed that Libra might be the last chance for Facebook to convince everyone to trust it again by building a system that they're far enough out of that we can rely upon to run transactions. Of course, there's many in the crypto community who view Libra with hostility and say it's a co-option of the decentralization and libertarian ideals of cryptocurrency.
Where do you think this places Bitcoin with US Congress? So Libra is obviously part of Facebook to some extent, mainstream potentially. But where do you think this places Bitcoin?
Well, it's interesting you asked that, Fred, because even this morning, Twitter's been lighting up with various congressmen coming out and saying, we like Bitcoin. There's almost arisen a bit of a wedge of some Congress people saying, we don't like Libra because it's Facebook and Facebook has problems, but we do like Bitcoin because of these libertarian ideals. So you have a number of congressmen members and perhaps senators who are a bit more closely aligned with that very, very strict free market ethos and saying, well, hang on, Bitcoin actually philosophically meets that libertarian ethos. It doesn't meet certain consumer protection ethoses, which might also explain why the Democrats, who are a bit more politically aligned to that approach, have taken the steps they have in getting these hearings happening.
Do you think, I guess from a US Congress perspective, and I guess, the US government, they see Libra as more of a threat to the US dollar than, say, Bitcoin?
It's a hard question to answer. I was on a panel the other week and someone was saying that, and I disagreed vehemently with him, but now having seen President Trump's tweets expressly saying the US dollar will always be king, that almost by implication suggests that he's concerned, and there's been comments coming from regulators in the US saying this is a concern. But we also have Libra's head, coming out and saying we are not trying to replace or interfere with sovereign currencies. We will not do that. We will work with the central banks to ensure that that doesn't happen. Now, practically speaking, we'll see what occurs down the line, because at one level, any payment processor or non-cash payment facility has a potential to grow so big that it could cause an impact on what's happening with the sovereign currency. But at least Facebook is coming out, sorry, not Facebook, Libra is coming out and Calibra to say, this is not what our intention is, and we're going to work with you to ensure that doesn't happen.
Yeah. And I think, potentially in terms of adoption as well, like it could be quite challenging in that, a Libra could be, it's a basket of currencies, right? It's not US dollars, it's not euros, it's not pounds, it's not Australian dollars. It could be, it's a collection of things. And that makes it very challenging from a everyday usage perspective, right? So from that perspective, but if they change that, say, and they did have a certain one that was in US dollars, do you think they could put a sanction or some, can they pass some law to stop it?
Potentially, but we don't know exactly how the nodes are going to operate yet. And my crystal ball, which I gazed in last year when Facebook's rumours of a currency were coming out, was completely wrong, because I thought the Libra project would ultimately be a stable Australian dollar, a stable US dollar, a stable Canadian, a stable euro, for that reason, so that it would get around that problem that cryptocurrencies have, where I will not pay for my coffee this morning in 0.00000005824 Bitcoin, because I can't work it out in my head when the price is given to me. But I think Libra may suffer from the same challenge if it's being put to an end user in a fraction they can't really understand. So a telling point of the testimony which before Congress and the Senate was a constant reference to it will be one-to-one backed, but no reference to what that one will be. Yes. There is already something called special drawing rights that exist internationally between countries used for accounting at the global level. But again, those all have that measure has a different value. So I think that we'll see Libra work in the back office, and perhaps you might see payments being processed by someone like Uber or one of the association members without telling you that it's Libra, because it will save them a large amount of time and money versus those payments going through a traditional banking process.
Okay. So when it comes down to it, again, I think this is one of the parts I think people are concerned about, and they've always been concerned about with Bitcoin, even Libra. Like, how would someone like the US government, I guess, clamp down on Libra, for example, and really control it to some extent? What techniques could they use?
Well, the simple one is outlawing something and making it illegal for someone to offer payment in this method or collect it or participate in a network. In the same way that it is illegal for you to run a gambling operation that you offer to me, and it'd be illegal for me to participate in it.
Right.
But being in the technology world, we're used to things like, in the recent history, we have Uber, who came here and was effectively completely illegal and paid the fines of drivers until such time as the laws were changed. Yes. So if something is popular enough, then the laws will be amended to accommodate it, because ultimately the laws are there to serve society and try and ensure that risks are managed appropriately and behaviour is nudged, but in the right direction. But if a population wants to do something such that a law is not respected anymore, then the law needs to be amended so that it will accommodate what's going on. Now, that's not to say that pure lawlessness will be allowed, because I'm sure many people would love to not pay tax and launder money, and so there's laws that just can't be changed around that. But a lot of payment processing is already a licensed activity. So I think it's an important distinction to draw between Libra, the protocol, which is what's been proposed so far, and what's going to sit on top of the protocol between end users and the use of that protocol to move value around. And in the congressional and Senate hearings, Calibra's head was very clearly saying constantly, let's separate out Calibra, who will need to comply with all sorts of financial services regulations in each country they operate in, and in the US, every single state, because of the way that they work, and the Libra protocol itself, which is analogous in many ways to, say, TCP or some other protocol. In and of itself, the protocol doesn't do anything. It's only when you have some kind of application on top that enables you to move things around. In the same way that a Bitcoin wallet you might conceptually think of as different and providing a function as opposed to the actual Bitcoin blockchain itself. And someone who is, for example, writing some data to the Bitcoin blockchain because they want to store it there and keep it safe is going to have very little in the way of financial services regulations impacting them, versus someone who says, I'm going to offer a wallet product that enables Fred to send some money to Mike very easily. That might be a non-cash payment facility that they need licensing for. So all of the regulation and licensing will be at the interface level on top of the blockchain. The actual Libra protocol is completely separate, and it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to make any laws that actually deal with that as a protocol, in the same way that it's very difficult to make any laws in relation to, say, the Bitcoin blockchain.
Okay, interesting. Now, what about in terms of, I guess, other governments around the world? We've seen the US government talk about this. You know, have you had any sort of, is Australia doing something on this?
Well, first of all, I'll say that the UK has probably been the most receptive to the Libra project. Their Reserve Bank head has made some positive comments. I've been fortunate enough to meet with our newest minister, the first time Australia's had a minister for fintech. Senator Jane Hume is our Assistant Minister for Finance, Superannuation
Welcome,
and
Jane.
Fintech. So she's picked up the portfolio, I think, 3 or 4 weeks ago. I'm not sure of her exact date. And it's fantastic to have in Cabinet a member of Federal Parliament who has a focus on fintech, which is great. So, as I mentioned before, we've had great early movement in the AML CTF space to help give greater certainty to crypto markets. I think that there's a real challenge because jurisdictions like Singapore and Malta and Gibraltar and the Caribbean have made friendlier regulations and an easier interface with regulators, such that we've seen, certainly from Australia, an outflux of blockchain and DLT projects and crypto projects offshore. And that's also in part, I think, influenced by the anti-encryption laws that Australia passed last year. I know of at least 2 projects that have specifically said we will not develop in Australia because we will not take the risk that the privacy we want to offer our clients is compromised by these laws which don't exist in another jurisdiction. And that was something that came out in the Senate and congressional hearings as well, the constant refrain from the Representative Calibra there saying if the US doesn't regulate and make this friendly, it will go offshore. And Australia, I think, faces that same challenge. We're lucky to be early movers. Now we'll see what happens next and whether or not we can help promote and support a local industry in what will be the equivalent, in my view, of the internet of our time.
Okay, interesting. Now, I guess in terms of Libra and its rollout, could we see a fractured Libra? Could we see a way where it's legal in some places and, I guess, not as friendly in others?
It's quite possible. I mean, there's been reporting saying that India has banned Libra. Not really. India has banned all cryptocurrencies. China similarly has some very strict bans. But there's a difference between something that is banned and whether or not people are still doing it anyway. And I don't know what the numbers are and whether people are actually obeying those bans and following through. We have huge numbers of WhatsApp and Facebook users, particularly in India. And if Facebook turns on some function that India thinks is illegal, they'll be talking to Facebook about saying, no, we want those disabled in your apps. But certainly if private citizens want to use VPNs and other means to go outside the country and do it in a secretive way, in the same way that piracy was a massive problem until the industry evolved and streaming brought the price down, and all of a sudden piracy rates fell off a cliff. I think it's about an evolution and a journey of getting to a point where the economics make sense and the regulatory risk makes sense and consumer protection is adequate so that Parliament can feel comfortable about that.
Okay. What about, I guess, in terms of the economy, right? And in terms of a currency and its stability. They talk a little bit about this in some of the systemic economic risk, potentially, if Libra was more used, say, than a local currency in any particular country, how do you think? I guess there's two sides to this, right? So in a country, say in the UK or Australia or the US, where it's very stable, but they lose control, say, of the currency, and then you've got the other side of it, is where you've got an unstable currency, say in a country like Venezuela, Argentina, etc. There's sort of two sides to that in and of itself. How do you think that's going to play out?
That is a really fascinating question, and I did economics at university, so I follow it with interest. But I think the first experiments in that will probably be some small island nations that I suspect will view a project like Libra as giving big advantages in having a digital currency with very little to no investment by a government. I think in the larger countries, you're going to see, just like China recently announcing a state-sponsored cryptocurrency, that this may move plans forward by entire countries to issue their own digital currencies. And that kind of innovation and competition should be welcomed, because transactions and payments and remittance have been expensive, filled with delays and costs for a long time, which is a drag on economic growth. So if central banks get involved in putting out their own cryptocurrencies, number one, they'll learn a great deal and help understand how better to regulate it. But number two, they may end up providing something that is a competitor to Libra. But Libra also, has also stated several times they want to work with central banks and G7 to make sure that they are not destabilizing or posing a systemic risk. But there's a question of, well, is Mastercard or Visa posing some kind of systemic risk because you are paying through their system? The real difference between the two is that money could go into the Libra token and stay there versus, say, a traditional payment processor where it may go in at one point and come out another point after some delay. And so I think it'll be a wait-and-see approach to see if we start to see value being moved into Libra, but economically that's going to be reflected in a basket of investments, so it does start to drift towards some interesting things around economic policy for countries. But I don't think that's fleshed out yet, and it's very early days. I think, as Senator Toomey said, it's wildly premature to try and shut something like this down. And what was his great quote from the Senate hearing? There's no reason to strangle the baby in the crib. You've got to see what's going to happen. And so far, the Libra Association is saying all the right things in terms of what they intend to do. The problem is Facebook said all the right things, and and that didn't work out in many ways. So I think that's causing them some challenges.
100%. Now, there's another thing going on at the same time. There's this Keep Big Tech Out of Finance bill. That's pretty wild. Considering, you've got big banks like Goldman Sachs having huge numbers of developers. You've got other major financial institutions having just as much technology. I'm interested in, it's confusing what big tech is to some extent. But just to high level zoom out, this Keep Big Tech Out of Finance bill, what is that? Can you help us understand that?
So that's a bill that's been proposed ostensibly to try and shut down Libra and Facebook's involvement in Libra. I've read the bill. If anyone has trouble going to sleep at night, I can send them a link. Unless they're lawyers, they may find it helpful. It fundamentally has a really, really vague definition of what a big tech company is, but a threshold of revenue of $25 billion. And essentially says they may not provide services which are analogous to banking or payment services under a threat of $1 million a day fine. Number one, the definitions are really problematic, which is a common problem with any law, but it's a very early draft that's been released, and those kinds of drafts just carry on. The second issue is large tech companies, $1 million a day fine is almost a license fee, and it may be viewed as such. But the reality in the US is that something like that is highly unlikely to make it past the Senate. So it may be being put up by those who want to draw more attention to this project and push them towards saying the things that they've said in the recent hearings, that they want to be compliant, they want to work with lawmakers and help educate government. And that's one of the biggest hurdles, I think, which is faced. There's a lot of fear, and a lot of the questions coming out of the hearings was, how can you explain to my constituents that they shouldn't be afraid of your technology when they don't understand your technology? And when that question is put, the inference is the senator or congressperson asking the question also doesn't understand the technology. Again, Senator Toomey seemed to understand it, and several other politicians have come out in America saying we see huge potential for distributed ledger technology. And Senator Hume has put some comments and articles out in the past about the massive potential for DLT and blockchain to make so many parts of our economy and government work more efficiently. And that is so powerful, but so few people have got their heads around just how powerful it is, in the same way that for a very long time the internet was the domain of highly technical people who were super excited about its potential but couldn't drive the adoption because of those technical barriers. I see DLT and blockchain in the same space. Those who get it get very, very excited, myself included, probably present company included, but getting it over the hurdle of making it usable for people has always been a challenge.
No, but, let's take a step back, because India has identified some of these things, right? They've said you can work on these techs to make it, provide the benefits of the financial system, but you can't make something that transfers value. So they're kind of trying to do this. And I'll just quote, they've identified in this bill an asset that is issued and transferred using digital ledger or blockchain technology, including so-called virtual currencies, coins, and tokens. That virtual currencies in and of itself, that potentially could sort of summate to being Bitcoin. And therefore, I want, the question I think, which I'm trying to, really get my mind around is, could they, ban Bitcoin?
Well, they could, but the design of the system makes it practically difficult to do so. And that is that key issue, again, around, say, things like these peer-to-peer transfer of virtual currencies are extremely difficult to stop from a technological perspective. Therefore, just like peer-to-peer piracy, there's a bit of a game of whack-a-mole that law enforcement can play, but the real change is when the economic model shifts such that it's no longer attractive to take that path. The example of streaming again, it just kills people doing piracy because there's a lawful path which makes sense and generates value. In the same way, I would say, I don't think there's a huge risk of governments moving to try and ban properly decentralized digital currencies as they currently exist, because practically it's so difficult to do. A ban would risk making a government or regulator look foolish because they can't. And going back in time, might they have tried to ban it? Had they known how they would have grown to date? I'm not sure. But if it's not going to work, then there's no point in doing it, because it only will blow up in their face.
So if Bitcoin is the BitTorrent of cryptocurrency...
I don't know if we should use that comparison. But
well, it sounds like it, right? You can't shut down BitTorrent, you can't shut down Bitcoin. Do you think Libra will be the Netflix of cryptocurrency?
Quite possibly, because if the Libra transfers are put behind nice UX, easy to access, fully regulatory compliant, lawyers have checked everything, there's no risk to the consumers behind that layer, then it could be a very, very valuable way to transfer value around. I mean, US Congress didn't have a problem with JP Morgan announcing they were using a cryptocurrency internally pegged to the US dollar to balance up their interbank transfers and work out their ledgers. And perhaps if Libra had said, we're only going to do this in the back end for our association members, it might not have met with the same response.
They kind of have.
Well, their mantra has been more,
bigger than
we want to help the unbanked, which has been something that's been a common mantra in all cryptocurrencies going way back. Yeah. A lot of white papers in 2016, 2017 were talking about reaching the unbanked, and projects in developing countries have focused on a lot of bringing people into a system who are using phone credits to transfer value around, which are being issued. So there's already these kinds of alternate currencies being used. It's just many of them were highly centralized and have a huge amount of risk. Also, fundamentally, 5 mining pools make up more than 51% of Bitcoin, and there's maybe 30 to 50 core developers who are really working on it. I mean, there's an argument to say the Libra Association, even not being dreadfully decentralized, has a greater level of decentralization in reality, based on what they're saying they'll do, than most blockchains which exist today. Insert your comments disagreeing below.
Okay, let's talk about Visa and Mastercard now, right? What do you think their angle with all of this is? Because they're not a bank. There's no banks involved necessarily with the first 29 nodes that have been, nominated. What do you think their angle is in this?
Look, it's hard to say. They're payment processors, and this is a technology to enable faster, cheaper payment processing in the future. So there's a natural synergy, and they have a similar reach. So being involved makes sense. I was surprised there were no banks that were saying they wanted to be in the Libra Association. that could also be because of regulatory concern around banks have long had a aversion to cryptocurrencies.
Definitely.
Because of this
And do you think-
misunderstood idea about money laundering.
Yeah, and do you think that aversion to cryptocurrency and its association with, its internal peg, it's been pegged as illegal and, those kind of things, it's actually blindsided them from getting involved in something which has gone all the way up to Congress? Do you think that internal policy has actually inhibited their opportunity here?
I think so. It wouldn't surprise me if a bank moves to ultimately join the association once they are comfortable that regulators are on board. Because banks have to be, by the nature of their highly regulated and licensed nature, be conservative about these things. Now, many who work in crypto and say this is terrible for money laundering and whatnot have viewed the position of banks as saying, oh, you're way too conservative because, hey, you can do all these things worse with cash, and the banks happily have cash transactions going on. But I think you might be right that by having that super conservative approach and being very, very negative towards cryptocurrencies, they may have missed an early opportunity. So it'll be interesting to see over the course of the next year if we see some banks join. And again, I think it'll be some smaller, perhaps state level, perhaps even in Wyoming, where there's a lot of movement happening in the US to have these banks that can do things using crypto assets, or in small island nations getting on board.
Okay. Now, so zooming out, we've heard you don't think they're going to ban Bitcoin. You don't think they might try, and they're obviously going to heavily regulate Facebook and its AML, KYC, and its those kind of aspects. Where do you think we're going to go from here?
Well, look, I think that Libra is going to continue developing, and they're going to continue and roll out some kind of test net, likely involving some of their partners. But the first step will be keeping it completely in the background. I think that the furthest step away is where they are going to be offering services to retail customers. In financial services, there's always a big step in the regulatory compliance required if you're dealing with sophisticated and wholesale and very large entities versus retail mum and dads. That's where consumer protection jumps up significantly. I mean, one of the questions put at the Senate was, how are you going to stop immutability of transactions if there is fraud? And the answer was, we will have a policy around that. We will act to protect around that front. I suspect that part of the earnings from the Libra reserve will be going into some kind of self-insurance for that, because if you lose your credit card, in many cases, automatically your bank looks after you and says, we found some fraudulent transactions, here's a new card, we've already taken care of them.
Yeah.
And then you marvel at their AI that worked out someone was buying petrol or whatnot with your card. And I certainly, when I lost my card once, the bank fixed it before I even knew there was a problem and realized I'd lost my card. And that's a very nice feature that current cryptocurrencies don't have. And I think that the Calibra and the Libra protocol will be needing to fix some of these problems that have plagued blockchain and cryptocurrencies and slowed down adoption. They're going to be focusing on that completely. So next steps, it's going to be baby steps along. I think the analogy of a baby in a crib is sensible. It's going to have to learn, grow. There's going to be some small tests. There's going to be a lot of interfacing with regulators, an awful lot of lawyers getting involved to try and ensure that the technology is going to work in a way that will leave regulators comfortable. But we will get to eventually to that point. And I mean, it's worth noting.
You don't think it's too political?
No.
Like that it'll stop?
It can't, because you already have a provider like WeChat in China, huge, providing electronic transfers of money. And I think someone said to me once, using cash in China is a sure way of signaling you're a foreigner versus paying for things with WeChat, because it's so prevalent now. In some ways, Libra is playing catch up to WeChat. And I think that something like WeChat trying to move into America and provide payments which too close to a government that the US has concerns around monitoring and surveillance would have a far frostier response than Libra has received.
100%. And I've seen a lot of that. The Alipay, WeChat, and you've got the CBDC, digital asset, now also starting up. Really interesting times. Michael, thank you so much for coming to join us on the Daily Exchange.
Thanks for having me.
And I appreciate, obviously, we have one final question that we ask everyone that comes on the show. Midnight this year, the clock strikes 12. What do you think the price of Bitcoin will be?
Which day?
In US dollars. On New Year's, is it New Year's Eve or New Year's Day? New Year's Eve?
I think it should be New Year's Eve.
New Year's Eve. Well, if it's 12, I don't know. Either way, we'll take 11:59.
Well, as a lawyer, I always have to caveat everything by saying, number one, I don't trade Bitcoin. Number two,
financial.
not financial or legal advice. I'm pretty bullish because of the whole nature of the fixed supply and the upcoming halvening. So I think the price on that time has a very good chance of being all-time high. I don't know if I could put a number on it, but I think it could be in all-time high territory.
Wow. Okay, interesting stuff. All right, guys, there it is. Marco Pacina joining us, partner at Piper Alderman, leader of the blockchain and fintech group. He is your man when it comes to anything blockchain and legal. Check it out, guys, and thanks very much for joining us. Do subscribe, do follow us on the Daily Exchange. Yeah!